Hello, career competitor. This is Steve Meller, as always, here to share with you some powerful conversation and some significant insights into what it means to optimize your career in pursuit of your optimal self. I am excited to be introducing our guest here shortly. But as always, let me draw your attention to careercompetitor.com, where you'll see right at the top of that homepage is a place where you can enter your email and become a part of my monthly subscription, my mid-monthly message, where I am just simply giving you that little nudge in the middle of the month to remember that whatever it was you set out to achieve with all that energy at the outset of the month and whatever those lofty goals may be at the end of the month, that you're not going to lose sight of that journey in between. Become a part of my community today. Head to careercompetitor.com, enter your email, and look forward to my next mid-monthly message. Now, let's get right into the show. Hello there, and welcome in to this episode of Career Competitor, where we will be discussing all things candor and communication with my guest, Todd Holzman. Todd will be getting his introduction here in just a moment, but before we dive in, here's 3 things to be on the lookout for within today's episode. Firstly, Todd explains why the admiration we have for others can serve how we show up in the world. Secondly, we discuss the importance of stepping into conversation as a way to pursue personal growth. And finally, Todd discusses some of the traps that we can fall into around our attempts to build relationships. So these 3 things, so much more within this very unique conversation with Todd Holzman on this episode of Career Competitor, and I hope you all enjoy. Okay, our career competitor today is a proven educator of leaders across some of the world's most competitive and renowned organizations. As the founder of their global leadership consultancy, our guest's real work process has been used by numerous Fortune 500, FTSE 100, and Global 2000 companies to transform their leaders, cultures, and business results. While their experience speaks for itself, our guest is also a tried and tested student themselves, having had stops on their educational journey at Cornell, Columbia, and Harvard. You may have heard of those. Having made it their life's work to improving the conversations people have with each other, our guest is on a mission to help people everywhere see the importance of unlocking the power of candor. With that being said, I'm looking forward to a conversation filled with candor, which is why I'm delighted to welcome into Career Competitor, Mr. Todd Holzman. Todd, how are we doing, brother?
I'm great. What an exciting introduction. Thank you.
You're an exciting person, man. You're an exciting person.
No, just your passion and energy, enthusiasm, and how articulate you are. I was like, you're great. Thank you.
You're so welcome. And here's the thing, I joked about this right before we got recording, but we've been chatting for a good 10 minutes before we even press record. I would argue there could have even been some reason to press record a little earlier, because here we are having a conversation around the notion of candor and how it can truly support people in their pursuit of their optimal self, which is what we're all about on this show. So before we maybe go into some of the X's and O's, let's say, and the practices of candor itself, Todd, I would love to just learn, based on your story, when it was maybe that you saw this notion of candor being something that is not only important, but it was going to become your life's work.
There's when I realized it become my life's work, but the roots of it started earlier. And I think I want to explain that, because I think my story, I think a lot of people have the same story. So, as a kid, my father, who's actually sadly very ill right now, so I'm thinking a lot about him, he always told me to be honest. Not that he could always follow, that principle, but he definitely drilled it into me at an early age. And then I remember this going to my grandparents' wedding anniversary, 35th wedding anniversary. We had this great party, and we come back to the house, and my grandmother asks me, well, how did you like the party? And I hear my dad's voice in my head, be honest. And I said, I didn't like it. And she says, why not? I said, well, because you kept calling Grandpa an idiot all night, and I don't think you love him. So I'm like 7 years old, and
Sure.
my grandma is totally cool with it. She's like, "Aw," but my mom's not cool with it, and she pulls me to the side of the room and she says, "You can't talk to your grandma that way." But Dad always told me to be honest, and she's like, "Not that honest," So, and then I just from that point on, and I'm writing the book on this now, so I'm remembering all these stories. I always felt in a horrible kind of dilemma. If I didn't kind of say what I thought, I would just feel horrible. But then when I did, things went horribly. and I had no way to kind of resolve it. And and if I didn't like say what I thought, I would just feel like a coward and like a sellout and all of these things. But then when I did, sometimes people would get pissed off at me. And so then, I ended up really not realizing this is what I was doing, but studied a lot of things like around communication and negotiation and influence and public speaking and all these things and listening. I mean, I could teach you the greatest course on listening ever, but my ability to follow all the things that I was teaching was really limited. I was more interested in what I had to say than what anybody else had to say, for example. And so I went to, I did my master's, my first master's at Columbia University, and they had some consultants come in and run a mini workshop with us. And I fancied myself as a good communicator. And after I went through this exercise, I realized I had a lot of problems with the way I communicated and the way I interacted with people. And that I started realizing the source of a lot of my frustrations around the conversations not going as I hoped they would go were kind of my fault. There were things that I didn't realize that I was doing and not doing, which were preventing me from getting better results. And then, it was kind of like a conversion experience for me. And then I went on this crusade of, okay, I'm going to help other people. I'm going to try to solve the problem that I'm suffering for because I think other people are suffering from it as well. And that was a little over 30 years ago now. And then since then, that I've dedicated my life to helping people have much better conversations with each other about anything that matters. And we've now developed.
That's an important. Well, I was just going to say that's an important caveat right there. Anything that matters.
Yeah. Why do you say that?
The reason I say that is I think sometimes it's the conversations that don't necessarily matter, that the outcomes of which we can sometimes hold on to those outcomes that more than likely it's an outcome that we don't want. And we allow something that's really not on the surface that big of a thing to become a big thing. And I can't help but hear what you're saying here and say immediately, okay, how do we ensure that we're actually we're aware that we're entering a conversation that matters? Because when we're aware of that, I would personally argue that the sheer practice of candor becomes a much more useful tool. When the conversation doesn't matter, you can kind of take it or leave it.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll just say, so notice what I did there. You made this point around, that's a really important caveat. And then I had this whole answer in my head. I don't know if you noticed, I stopped myself and I said, well, why do you say that? And by the way, it took me years to be able to just do that small thing.
Well, that's coaching, Todd. You're talking to a coach right now. That's coaching 101. Like every session I'm in with a coach, it's all I want to do is respond. It's like, why do you say that?
Yeah. And what was interesting, so this is the nature of conversations, right?
Sure.
You asked me a question. I'm telling you the truth of what I think to the best of my ability. You're kind of hearing me. I mean, we're not talking about anything that's really controversial, right? Where there's a potential for conflict or anything like that between us. That's when the whole thing will go pear-shaped. Yep. But then you kind of said something you responded because you were listening well, and you said something I didn't expect. And I was like, that's really interesting. And now, we could have a richer conversation because of it. Because that is the thing. It's we don't need to care about candor around things that are trivial or we're just having fun. Even though, so you went to school in Louisiana, so clearly that is not a Cajun accent we're hearing.
It's
So,
not.
but there's a term, from the UK when I lived there. I called it recreational whinging. It's, it's fun to complain about things. So
That's right.
let's not get too sincere, for
Yeah.
goodness sakes, and let's not have to get to candor around what color should we paint the lines of the parking lot. As
Right.
long as it's not black and a black top, I think we're fine.
Right. Pretty much.
You know what I mean? But it is around, things that matter where candor is critical. And coming back to your original question, so anything that matters, meaning some problem or opportunity, we're talking about it because we don't yet understand it well enough and we don't know what to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, we have to have very truthful conversations with each other about it. And the thing is that none of us are kind of omniscient, right? So you've got a piece of the truth, perhaps. I've got a piece of the truth. Other people we're talking to. And then we kind of cobble it all together, and maybe we have a better understanding of reality than we would have otherwise had. And now we can figure out maybe what we can do about it, right? And that seems to be at least kind of obvious on its surface. But what's very interesting is that while this is I'll explain why, to the degree you want me to in a moment, why this is a vital capability for our success at work, for the effectiveness of our leadership, of our teams, of our people, of our organizations, and for having fulfilling lives. So I'll argue it's vital for so many reasons. All the research that I've done and the 50 years of research that comes before me and my colleagues shows that we are the least good at it when we need to be the most good at it. When the conversations really matter is when candor crumbles, and we are largely unaware of that fact. And that's why I've dedicated myself to it, because it seems so critical, yet no one, or I've never found anybody around something that matters. And when something matters, it usually feels like the conversation is going to be threatening and or embarrassing for someone. That's when we most need to be competent at candor. And that's when we implode.
I love it. And again, it's just to be full transparency to you as the listener now. Like, before we started here, Todd asked me, what can someone that does what I do for a living bring to a show like this, where it's about this individual fulfillment, so to speak, this individual pursuit of one's optimal self? And you've already hit a couple of things here that I think justify 100% why this is such a worthwhile conversation to be had on this podcast. Firstly, that simple notion of self-awareness, to notice that, hey, I am flawed when it comes to my communication. If I'm having this potentially outward negative influence in my life, maybe there's a discussion and an argument to be made that I'm probably got some negative influence coming my way too. If I'm not really doing this well outwardly, it's going to make it all the more difficult for me to do this inwardly in terms of how I receive information, how I hear information, etc. So that's the first piece, and I can already see your wheels are turning, and I want to get to that in a second. But secondly, this notion of the fulfillment that can come from actually mastering some of these techniques toward what it means to be able to communicate when you need to step into candor at those times of possible conflict, those times of possible high intense scenarios, whatever it may be. That is a competitive advantage. That is a way that you can advance in life, to know what to say, when to say it, and how to say it in the environments when you most need to. And all I hear is competitive traits, competitive advantages. But I want to go back to that first point, because I could see you immediately shifting your seat around that sort of notice that you had and some of those flaws.
So put the question to me, please.
Yes. So the question is, what is it about that moment where you recognized, hey, I'm flawed. I'm flawed when it comes to my ability to communicate. And as I look around me, I think, gosh, if I'm dealing with this, then there's no doubt that many, many other people are as well. Why is it something that we can maybe individually benefit from a competitive standpoint? What's the individual benefit to us to having that initial recognition that, hey, we are flawed when it comes to the way in which we communicate?
Okay, a lot to unpack there, because it's actually a very deep question. So no wonder why you're a good coach. Wait, is this my therapy session? So I think we first need to talk about, so why does candor matter in the first place? Because there's no point in realizing you've got gaps around it if you're not convinced it's absolutely critical to becoming your best self, to advancing your career, and to having the most fulfilling life that you possibly can. So let me just say a little bit about that. So from a psychological well-being standpoint, at least the ability to express oneself, you know what, let me stop myself. We should define the term first. So what do we actually mean by candor? Because there will be a lot of assumptions about what we mean when we talk about it. Because candor does not equal honesty. Okay? Honesty is a portion of it. So it's not just kind of saying whatever you think and feel. You know, a large UK bank, the managing director of talent said to me, you know, we created a leadership principle called something like straight talk. And all the sociopaths came out of the woodwork saying everything they thought and felt. I was like, that's fantastic. So because candor without the right intention, without the intention to truly understand the truth and do good, it can end up being cruel. On the other hand, it's not only about saying what you think and feel, right? Yep. Because no one has an exclusive access to the truth of things. So the way I think about candor, and it was actually defined for me by a pharmaceutical executive, because he explained to me what I'm doing, which was very embarrassing and inspiring at the same time. He's like, and I can't do the British accent because it was a guy in the UK. He says, fundamentally, I always see these conversations as like something I have to win and not lose. And now I realize these conversations, I need to treat every single one of them as a collaborative search for the truth in order to make things better. And that really hit me, Steve. So then the question is why reframing these conversations as neither things to avoid because there's some conflict that you're worried about, nor something to compete within, to have your view of things and what you want to happen to win the day. Why is seeing these important conversations that you have with your clients, your customers, the people that you're coaching, the people on your team, your colleagues, your boss, whomever it might be, why is seeing them as a collaborative search for the truth in order to make things better going to make your life better? Now, part of it is authenticity, right? Expressing the truth of what you think. That's still an important piece of it. But again, it's not just to emote, it's not just to vent, it's not just to be real, right? You're expressing the truth of what you think in order to figure out with other people what actually might be true, which may not be exactly what you think to be true. Okay. Well, when you look at all the psychological literature, every measure of psychological well-being the clinicians care about is either caused by or significantly correlated to the ability of people to express themselves authentically. Number one. So if you care about your well-being, you listen for the truth and you speak the truth as you see it. Because we all know what happens to us when we don't do it. Unless you become deeply repressed, these things that you sidestep will haunt you and will bother you. And they will be this noise that's always in the background that's cannibalizing your energy because it's something that's bugged you for a reason and that you haven't addressed it. You've danced around it. You've made it okay, whatever it is. And I'm talking about in work and outside of work. So that's the psychological well-being piece. A huge part of life is relationships, man, as we know, right? In and outside of work. And if you're not bringing your real self to it, you're not having a relationship. And many of us live with superficial relationships in this short time, and we endure them, and we feed them because we're afraid of it being worse. We're afraid of making something that ain't that good in the first place worse. So we satisfy. One of my coaches told me a story about how her mom divorced her father, and then he died, 30 some odd years later. And then she was reflecting, he was the love of my life. And I never told him what it was about him that was bothering me. I smiled and I sat on it and I divorced it. And I squandered what could have been 3 beautiful decades because I didn't speak up. And at work, what is leadership? And first of all, organizations, you can't solve any problem you can't talk about. And the things that are most difficult to talk about are things that where there's the potential for conflict that are threatening or embarrassing, right? And things that are complex. And so we can't solve any problem we can't talk to each other about openly and honestly. But as a leader, what is leadership ultimately? Leadership is ultimately, unless you're kind of thinking about some antiquated notion, is something you do when you're the authority figure, but something you do beyond your authority, is you see some problem or opportunity that other people aren't paying sufficient attention to, have found ways to avoid, are struggling to deal with. And now you got to get them to face it and do something about that and support them through a process of taking on those things and making things better. And so what is that but an honest conversation with people where you're looking at the truth of things, reality, together. And so this is why I think it's so critical. And to your point, if you don't recognize the errors that you make during these critical conversations, which we all do, then it's very disempowering, Steve. Because if you can't see how you're contributing to the problems that are frustrating you, then you can't do anything about it. Because then it's now all the problems are outside of you. It's this person's an asshole, this person's defensive, HR wouldn't let me do it, there isn't time, all external excuses. And the more you externalize things that are a problem, the less powerful you will feel in being able to deal with them.
Yeah, I am so appreciative that you took us to the answer and around the answer in the sense of providing that definition around candor. Because Todd, the first thing in my preparation for this, I'm reading all about you, and I do the same thing with it in my coaching now because words matter. We talk about communication right now. The understanding what a certain word means to one person as opposed to the person they're speaking to, like taking the time to actually get clear on that, it actually matters. And a word like candor, to your point, has now turned into an assumption of, someone's about to speak to me very honestly. And that's it. But when you look at the definition, it talks about being frank, it talks about being open, and it talks about being sincere. That's at the heart of the definition. That's really important to understand that for candor to actually be present, those 3 things need to be present. And that definition... Lovely. That definition that you provided, the collaborative search for the truth in order for things to get better, like, wow, like that hits frankness, that hits openness, and that hits sincerity right there on the head. There's no doubt about it. I got to give the credit to
this guy. His name is Ed Jenkins. I was interviewed by the Irish Independent, so I mentioned him in the article, and he was actually happy for it. I think he works at Merck now or someplace. Anyways, he's a great guy, and thank you, Ed, for giving that to me.
And we'll have to get this episode to Ed too. We'll have to send that to him. But okay. And then as you brought that back around, though, to the 2 things that I hear there in abundance, the psychology of it and the relationship standpoint of it. And as an individual, if we're just going to stay on the individual right now, whether you're a leader or not, as an individual looking to optimize oneself and be competitive within your career, if you don't have a firm grasp from a psychological and from a relationship standpoint, how you are showing up in your respective industry, in your respective pursuit of success, then you are not operating in a competitive position, period. Like you have to do the work on a psychological level to understand how you're showing up and what you do and don't know about yourself. And then you also need to be abundantly aware in the way in which you're connecting and creating these relationships. And for me, that is why I exist and do what I do. It is why you exist and do what you do, because we're in many ways people are saying, hey, I'm curious to know what it is I'm not seeing and what it is I need to hear, because for whatever reason, I'm not seeing it and hearing it on my own terms. I need someone to help me with that. So I'm just curious, Todd, like in your world, when you hear me sort of break it down like that, how is this resonating with you in terms of just your day-to-day, in the sense of how are these folks coming to you and saying, hey, this is the spaces where I feel as though my blind spots are? Because I think if you can acknowledge some of the blind spots that you're helping people with in this work, I think some of our listeners can immediately be like, oh, I've never thought about that. Okay. That is 100% a place where I need to start paying some attention.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe we could get concrete here about what are the things that I think your listeners, but all of us need to be aware of in terms of these conversational traps that we all seemingly fall into? Because we've analyzed tens of thousands of conversations that didn't produce results that people wanted. And there's always an error that they're making, which is contributing to that fact. And there's only a handful of errors that people make all around the globe, regardless of company, country, and culture. I want to get 3 C's in there. So, but I will say, before I go there, I will say, because your question is at least what I'm inferring from your question, it's a two-part, like, what do people need to be aware of? But the value of self-awareness also is, listen, everybody listening right now, you all know leaders that you can, and people in your life who are straight with you, and you could count on them to be so. You trust them more than other people. You also know people who are better listeners than other people. And it really, like, they're really curious. They really want to understand things. You like working better with them. And compared to people who have their own, compared to people who are conflict avoidant, right, and don't have the courage to kind of lean into difficult things, compared to people who've got to win the argument and not lose, right? Those people who are more courageous to kind of lean into the truth, those people who don't care about winning and being right and not being wrong, but really care about what's true and are genuinely curious. And if you're right and they're wrong, they're happy about it. Those are the people you esteem, right? So if that's true, then become the kind of person that you most esteem. We esteem people who are committed to the truth and who are committed to the truth on behalf of making things better. That's who we respect. It's in every movie, it's in every piece of literature, it's in every religious and philosophical and mystical text. The people we admire are truth seekers who are trying to do good in the world. They exhibit courage and curiosity and compassion. So if you want to become your best self and advance yourself in the world, commit yourself to that. And one of the avenues for doing that is through your conversations. Every day you see problems and opportunities around you to make things better. You got a choice. You going to lean into it or are you going to sidestep it? Now, you should probably sidestep a lot of the things, right? Because you've got a lot of things going on. Right. But there are so many opportunities for you. And in those opportunities, those conversations, it's not only an opportunity for you to make a bigger difference, but it's an opportunity for your transformation too, for your growth. Because one, you're stepping into, as you call it, your kind of optimal self. Somebody who's more courageous, somebody who's more curious, somebody who's more compassionate, and who is putting the truth and doing good above all else, above your fears, above your egos, above everything. And then you have an adventure, man, because you don't know what's going to happen. Okay? So that is more around, I guess, my attempt to kind of inspire, call people, motivate people to kind of seize the day, man. Life is short. Life is too short to sidestep the hard conversations. Right. And it will benefit you tremendously, even if in the moment it doesn't feel that way. We have to act as if, with the faith, this is Jordan Peterson now, that the best thing that can happen, that could possibly happen, will come from your genuine pursuit of the truth, even if it doesn't feel like in the short term. Yep. But I also want to turn it into a competence. Because courage without competence could get people killed off in their careers, their credibility, and sometimes their lives. And we were dealing that when I was on the teaching staff at the Kennedy School, okay, with students who were trying to exercise leadership inside of their respective countries. But in our daily lives, just some traps to watch out for, okay? I'll give you, there's about 10 to 12 of them that are very common. We won't go through all of them now. So, leading questions, right? We'll go through leading questions, jumping to action, and piling. Those are my three of my favorites. So leading questions are, let's say my partner Olga was listening to this conversation, and she would say to me something like, Todd, do you think it really was a good idea for you to talk as much as you did on that podcast? Now, we all know what she's saying, right? It ain't a question, man. It's a point of view barely disguised as a question. Right. But this is what people do all the time. When they're worried about how somebody's going to respond to what they say, they kind of frame it in the form of a phony question. because if I come out and say what I think, well, it's going to piss the person off. They're going to get defensive, insert reason. And so let me kind of help them, like, let me make it their idea. Well, one, we're not so easily fooled anymore. The days of how to win friends and influence people, you say my name a few times and now I'm going to buy the car. I mean, those
Right.
are long past, man.
Yeah.
But also, two, what we see from the research is that when people use leading questions as an attempt to avoid upsetting people, it guarantees people are going to get upset.
Yep.
Because people don't like being controlled and steered. And they start thinking, if you have a view, why don't you just tell it to me?
Right.
So that's a leading question. Okay. So the point is, if you're going to ask a question, ask a real question. And if you've got something to say, then say it. But don't confuse the two things and mix them up. Keep them pure. That's leading questions, something to avoid. Watch out for doing it. Don't you think? If I would have thought that, I would have said it. Another one is jumping to action, is watch out for this. If you find yourself early in a conversation saying, like, I think we need to, you're suggesting a solve for a problem that more likely than not has not been discussed. And even if it has been discussed, there's no agreement there's a problem.
Yep.
And people don't take action to problems that they don't agree actually exist. And so one of the conflict avoidance mechanisms or the control mechanisms that people use is they start talking about solutions before anybody has agreed on what the problem to be solved is. That's a classic one. And that creates a ton of rework, because if people don't agree, then no matter how good your idea is, nobody's going to take action on it. And then you're going to have numerous Groundhog Day conversations talking about the same bloody thing and over again and wondering why you're not getting a good result. This is classic. And then the third one is piling, which is what I'm doing right now, like making numerous points one on top of another. It's kind of the shock and awe strategy. The more I throw at you, the more likely I am to win the argument, right?
Yeah.
And it just doesn't work. Usually, you got to feed in aspects of the truth as you see it, kind of one snackable bite at a time. Because otherwise, then people won't pay attention to the one thing. You end up distracting them by giving them too many things to pay attention to. So those are some things for people to watch out for.
Well, I'm not getting distracted right now. I'm fully focused, and if Olga is listening to this, I think it's what you said your partner's name was.
Yeah.
I welcome the insights, and I put it all down to passion. That's all it is. Trust me, I have a wife that would be very. I don't know whether this is based on experience here, Todd, but if it was based on my experience, I have a wife that would share a very similar sentiment. So I'm just putting that out there. I'm just putting that out there. But this is, I think, when you talk about the first piece of your response here around this esteem that we can have for those in our worlds and in our networks. And when we recognize what it is we want to see in order to form trust towards another, why wouldn't we put that same expectation on ourselves? Right. And in doing so, serve ourselves competitively, know that we're immediately challenging ourselves to get better. Like, again, we can stay as we are, or we can look at this thing that we truly have admiration towards and say, how can I be more like that? I'm not going to be that person, but I'm going to try to at least take some of those very attributes and see how I can be implementing them within myself. But then some of those examples I think are so important. The big one I think is jumping to action, in my opinion, just that notion of, because we all have our own version of either the truth or version of the solution. And we certainly all have our own interpretation of the problem. And so how do we actually just say, hey, listen, before we jump to solution, before we jump to truth, what if we just got clear on your perspective of the problem and my perspective of the problem? And before we even arrive at any of these other spots, let's just stay in that area of the problem and see if we can both find any form of alignment around what this problem may or may not in fact be.
Let me say something about that. So I guess there's a simple way to think about this then that you're helping me with. First, align on the truth, then align on what to do about it.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. So the truth is equal to, when you were saying my perspective on the problem, and then creating common ground as to what the problem is. I'll call that the truth. The truth is what's reality. And often we're talking about what's the problematic reality that requires some new action. It could also be what's the exciting opportunity that requires new action. But when we say align on the truth, it's let's align on what the real problem or opportunity is before we talk about how to act upon it.
Yeah.
And then in order to create that alignment, we first need to both share our perspective on the problem or give our perspective on the problem and get other people's perspectives on the problem. That's why it's a collaborative search for the truth. And it needs to be done with courageous humility. I have to have the courage to express the truth of what I think, but have the humility to be open to being wrong about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the important mental stance when you're doing that. And so this is a mistake that a lot of, say, people managers make when they're, say, giving feedback or coaching to the people on their teams. By the way, as a quick side step, I think this is also important, even for entrepreneurs, right? Who, like, I spend a lot of time in organizations, helping leaders and people and salespeople at all levels have better conversations. Up, down, across, sideways, up, down, across, and outside of their organizations. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's also important for entrepreneurs because no, you can't really accomplish. Maybe there are some exceptions still, but you can't accomplish anything great in the world without other people. And that means you're going to have to work and partner with other people. And that means you're going to have conversations. And oftentimes the conversations are going to be challenging because people see things differently around what's true, and they have different ideas about what to do about it, right? But that's the richness, and that's where those differences can be leveraged to actually create things that are rather innovative, and you could solve complex problems through it. So back to the people manager piece, it's where they often fall down is they're doing one or the other. They're either stuck with just giving their versions of the truth or getting the other person's versions of the truth. And it's like we've seen in corporations, the big problem was command and control. Like managers are telling them, here's what's true and here's what you ought to do about it, right? And then the coaching movement comes in and we incredibly overcorrect. Now the managers can't tell people what they think anymore. They can only ask them what they think, and hopefully they'll self-discover and yada, yada, yada. And this is like,
right.
This is the problems with what people do with something like the Grow coaching model, right?
Yeah.
And I've been in the aftermarket. My faculty and I've been in the aftermarket for people who've been through this, and they're like, oh, I can only ask questions anymore. No, it's an adult-to-adult conversation where it's a collaborative search for the truth, and you both have valuable input on it, but together you're figuring out what's true.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you do that, a lot of times trying to figure out what to do about it, strangely, more often than not, it's the easy bit. The hard bit is for us having a common shared view of what the problem is, of what's true. And so I think that's a nice way to think about it. Align on what's true first with other people, and then align on what to do about it. And if your folks were to take away like that one thing, agreeing the problem before talking about solutions, I have found that to be revolutionary.
Yep. That
small tweak.
No doubt. And it's a foundational piece, which is why it takes longer, which is why it takes work. Foundations aren't built overnight, but it is a foundational piece in the conversation, I feel like, because the solution does always feel like, hey, how do we arrive at it as quickly as possible? And what would it look like just to be a little bit more patient on the front end when it came to actually getting aligned on that problem? And not an ounce of offense taken on the coaching front either, just to be clear, because for me, I was literally having this conversation about an hour before we recorded here with a fellow coach, is the importance in the coaching space, not to get off topic here, but the importance in the coaching space is to use gears within the coaching space. There are going to be times where you stay in the first and second gear and you stay curious, but there are going to be times where you've got to accelerate, and a client needs to hear something that they're not necessarily ready to hear. And it's the one piece in the coaching space that I think stands to that there's a lot of work to be done there for coaches to truly understand. Like, if we're just constantly curious, when do we move into the commitment part of the coaching process? When do we get people to commit on long-term or short-term solutions and actions that can truly serve that growth? Because curiosity gets you so far. It's a foundational piece. But again, I'm getting on my soapbox right now, and I'm going to stand right off and not get too far.
Or I'll step on it with you for a second, because this is the coaching racket. Right? At least in my mind. And because it's an easy thing to scale and sell, right? You could certify all these coaches, just make them curious, And just all you got to do is ask questions, man. And there's value in it because people aren't curious enough, and we don't ask enough good questions, and we don't know how to. And the people we're trying to help as coaches, or anyone you're trying to help in life, there often is untapped insights, ideas, and capabilities within them that if we could sometimes just be someone who can really listen, and we can ask them great questions, sometimes they can discover the real problems for themselves and the answers for themselves. And the degree to which they don't need us to do that for them, the better, because ultimately our job is to make ourselves useless, right? Our job is to help them be able to solve their own problems. And that is the acid test of how helpful we have been. Yes. However, everybody's got blind spots. And, you're designed and I'm designed and other people, we're all designed a certain way. And, and there's something that flows through us. And we've got a particular song to sing, which is not their song, but maybe it adds to the song sheet. And they're the richer for it. So when I was at IBM, again, I was this, I don't know if I said this to you before, but I was an executive coach to a segment of the Worldwide Management Committee, which is the top 30 executives there. Okay. And then a subset of the top 300 executives below was called the SLG, Strategic Leadership Group, and their leadership teams. And I remember working with, this was 24 years ago now. And I was working for a guy named Steve Ward, who was running the industrial sector. And, $13, $15 billion industrial sector. By the way, I'm like 30 years old. Like, what am I doing coaching this guy? Well, I had some chops around Candor and about having, have these kind of challenging conversations. And he became the guy when IBM sold Lenovo computers, right? With the ThinkPad, it became Lenovo, the Chinese company. He was their first CEO. And I was his third coach in the space of a year. And I remember him saying to me, this is what hit me, Steve, and this is also important for people who love just to ask questions and only questions. Yep. He said to me, I like you. I'm like, okay, why is that? He goes, most of what you say to me is wrong, but at least you have the courage to say it. And then it, which was like kind of backhanded compliment, right? You're rather stupid, but your stupid ideas are helping me think better. Right. And he said, but at least it gives me something, because sometimes you're right and you're pointing out something to me that I didn't see, but sometimes you're wrong and it gives me something to react to so that I'm able to better and more quickly figure out what I think. I'm like, okay, great. It's like, what is it? What is everybody else doing? They just question me to death. He goes, I have a mirror in the bathroom. I don't need one. I need somebody who could tell me things that I might not be aware of or I'm not taking serious enough. That's the value, because particularly somebody at my level, so much of the truth of what people feel is getting screened out because they're afraid of me because of my authority. I can't have that in you as a coach. I got to have somebody who's going to ask me questions, sure, who's curious, but then they're going to give something back to me as a result of that curiosity journey.
Right. Absolutely.
And that really stayed with me, Steve, to this day, obviously.
And that's that collaborative piece going all the way back to Ed's insight there many years ago. And it is a collaborative piece. And talk about collaboration, talk about passion, talk about sincerity. This has just been 45 minutes jam-packed with all of that. Jesus, and yeah. I know, like, again, I'm looking at I got to start making some apologies to a couple of folks I might be running over here. That's no, don't even.
I have a call in 2 minutes as well.
You have a call in 2 minutes. I have something in 2 minutes. Todd, listen, man.
Can I say something? I want to for your audience.
Yes.
If they email Todd Holzman, Candor @gmail.com. So TODD HOLZ, that's for you. HOLZMAN, Candor, CANDOR @gmail.com. And they put your name, Steve Meller Podcast, in the subject line. I've asked my producer to put together some free resources that I think they'll find useful around this topic.
Perfect. Awesome. That is an awesome bonus for anybody. I'm going to put it in the show notes as well.
Cool.
Todd, finishing abruptly, but hey, this has been nothing but passion and purpose and insight. And there you were about an hour ago wondering, hey, what can I bring to this show? And honestly, I could probably go for another 45 minutes. So that was just phenomenal stuff. I really appreciate the time, Todd. Thanks again for joining us, man.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And my thanks again to Todd for joining us on the episode today. And really my main takeaway here is just to challenge you around this notion of awareness. Are you aware of how you show up within communication, within relationships? How are you ensuring that at the heart of your relationship, there is true collaboration taking place? Whether you oversee people or not, this can be a personal benefit here that gives you a competitive advantage in life. People are going to trust you. People are going to want to get to know you more if you become more aware of some of these very notions that Todd was able to provide to us within this discussion. So just a real element of encouragement coming from me in closing here today, just to become a little bit more self-aware, to step into more conversations, but with this mindset of, hey, what can I learn in how I show up and how I impact this person, and how good a job am I doing at actually listening to this person and asking questions and supporting this person through their own personal growth as well. So this is truly a competitive advantage if you're willing to do the work around this, and I encourage you to absolutely do that. So again, Todd, I appreciate the time and all the generous insight that you provided around this discussion. And as you leave here today, as always, I encourage you to take that time to not only subscribe to the show so you're not missing out on future content, but please take the time, if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts especially, go ahead and review the show. Give us that 5-star rating that I know this content is completely worthy of. And if you are someone listening to this show for the first time, but you know that this content could be of value to someone else, go ahead and share the wealth, people. Pass this episode along to somebody within your community today so that they too can benefit from this fantastic content. So again, I appreciate you as always for checking out this podcast, for being a subscriber, for being a member of the audience of Career Competitor, and best of luck with anything and everything you've got going on within your world. And I look forward to doing this again with you very soon. Bye for now.